The last talk had to be about ethics. We listened heard very little about ethics yesterday and today, and the goal is to take you away a little bit from the policy-oriented or the technical focus and shift back to ethics, which means, to some extent, to have a more general or a more broad view, try to grasp the big picture. So bear with me at some point if some definitions don't really split the air in 4 parts. It's meant to give you more of an overview. The question I want to address is, what are the ethical problems in regulating information warfare? Now note that I said information, not cyber warfare. I'm going to go into that in a moment. It's not a typo, it's on purpose. So what I'm going to do is to start by giving you the big picture and to try to relate information warfare with the big picture. Discuss the regulatory and ontological gap, which I think are related, and one providing the grounding from the other. And then as I'm a philosopher, I cannot resist the temptation to tell you where to look to find a solution. There would be no fun otherwise. So the big picture. If there was just one word to describe society or reality as we know it these days, that would be the blurring. Now the blurring refers to the fading of all the lines, of all the distinctions as we knew them until yesterday. Think about private and public, the stuff that you publish on, or I publish on Facebook, and the things that my mom wouldn't dare to mention in a room with another person. Pretty much the same thing. The distinction between real and virtual. We are all here, but I bet that you're all on Facebook, that you're all on Twitter, or on whatever other social networks. And then the distinction between military and civil, which cyber warfare is kind of brought about very evidently. Now, this is important because it shows that the digital part, or the cyber part, has become a crucial bit of the reality in which we live, a fundamental threat. And there is no other way of putting the money where my word is by talking or mentioning the latest estimate from the World Economic Forum about the value of the internet economy in a few years' time. It will be up to the 5% of the GDP of the G20 countries. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of relevance. Now, information warfare is important in this context because it's the most compelling instance of this whole process, which I call the information revolution. The blurring is an effort of the information revolution, of the pervasive and capillary dissemination of ICTs, mostly. Now, what I take to be information warfare, and again, policymakers, lawyers, don't jump on the chair. Allow me a little bit of flexibility. So, is the use of information technology within an offensive or defensive military strategy endorsed by political authorities. And this pretty much cut the line between cyber warfare, information warfare, and crime, terrorism, hacking, whatever you would like to put outside this set. Aiming at the immediate disruption and control of enemy's resources, and which is waged within the informational environment, with agents and targets ranging both on the physical and non-physical domain, and whose level of violence may vary upon circumstances. What's the crucial bit among all these aspects? Information warfare is transversal. It's the key point I want to stress with you today. When we think about warfare, usually the scenario is divided in 2 parts. You have physical agent and targets, and whatever action happens between the two is going to be violent. Medium violent, highly violent, but violence is going to be there. On the other side, you have the digital agents and targets, and I mean, you can escalate, but as long as you stay within the digital domain, violence doesn't really seem to be part of the equation. And when you talk about traditional warfare, well, all the fun, all the actions happen in here. When it comes to information warfare, this is the situation. You don't know anymore what distinctions are there. You can have kinetic cyber warfare, so you can escalate from the digital to the physical domain. You can have stuff that happens just in the cybersphere, and so doesn't touch or affect anybody into the physical world. So the point is, how do we deal with this mess? It's a conceptual mess. Where do we go from here? And as a philosopher, the only way of starting addressing a mess is asking questions. So I'll throw there a few questions, and then I'll try to understand how to address them. So the questions are about concerns about the definition of the moral agent. In a context when we have human beings, human agents, and artificial agents acting and playing a role into this new scenario, where do we put the responsibilities? Who's morally responsible, before defining legal responsibility, for the actions that are performed there? Who are the moral patient? Whose rights are we going to preserve when cyber warfare is going to, a cyber attack is going to be launched? And what right are we happy, or are we thinking, or we should think of override in a case of cyber warfare? So these are the kind of questions that I take to be preliminary to any kind of discussion concerning the regulation of cyber warfare. And they are preliminary insofar as answering these questions will lead us to understand the novelty, the conceptual novelty posed by this phenomenon, and then to kind of pave the way to whatever policy or regulation we want to go through. So I'm not a lawyer, but when it comes to laws and regulation, there is, I think, this very trivial point that laws and regulation don't stay the same all the time. We don't abide anymore to the, the Babylonian law, and we have seen a few steps farther from that in the latest centuries or millennia. So the dynamic nature of law makes it unlikely that the same laws and regulation will remain the same while society experiences such radical changes, mainly through or via technology, but also via other means. So the question to address are how we should think of changing laws regulating information warfare or warfare at large, and what kind of principles we should endorse in doing so, in defining new rules or in revising whatever the rules that we already have. At this point, we are presented with a very polarized debate. On the one side, and I think that Mike Schmidt is a fair representative of this position, there are those who will claim that when it comes to cyber warfare, to the cyber sphere, we already have all the laws that we need. We don't need to do more. We don't need to write an extra law. We don't need to think more. All we need to do is to look into the body of laws and regulation that we have and understand how to apply those laws to the new scenario. And it's an approach that is kind of valuable for one thing, because it avoids the digital Wild West. God forbid that we all agree that there are no laws in the cybersphere. From tomorrow, everybody is happy and allowed to do whatever they want. We cannot afford that as a society because it's an information society, because we depend on information infrastructure, as I showed in the first couple of slides. The other point is that behind this position rests the idea that existing laws and regulations are not just applicable, but they are sufficient, at least for the time being, to address the cases of cyber warfare. Now, I take an issue with this because although I believe that laws and regulation can be applied, and we should look into that, there is a risk in that we focus so much attention and effort into applying what we already have that we miss the real big elephant in the room. We miss the conceptual novelties, the radical novelties that come with information warfare. And so we ended up focusing on stretching the blanket to providing ad hoc solution, and we lose the long-term effort. We don't achieve the main and most important goal that we should set for ourselves. Now, I take issues not just because I'm a person who likes to take issue, but because I believe that the approach that people are guiding people into focusing just on the application of existing laws to the case of cyber warfare rests on what is called an analogical approach. So we try to understand or to find analogies between cyber warfare and the laws that we have. And once the analogy is found, bang, we don't need to do anything anymore. We just need to apply the situations, the new situation to the cases already existing. There is a strong epistemic limitation in that. Information warfare or cyber warfare, depending on how wide you want the umbrella to be when we do these considerations, it's a radically new phenomenon. For the first time, we are considering a warfare where human beings are not the victims and not even the agents. The environment is not the environment as we knew it yesterday. It's not possible to focus just on the analogic approach. To give it in a very funny picture, do you know the toy that you give to toddler when you give them like a triangle in their hand, and then they have a shape of triangle in front of them, and they need to match the object with the shape? Well, we have a new object in our hand, and it's fine to try to see whether it fits all the shapes in front of us, but it becomes very silly if you decide that it has to be a triangle, although it's something new. So you cannot smash the object into the shape. At some point, you need a new shape. So that's what we have to do, or at least what ethicists are trying to do. I'll give a few examples of how existing regulation and laws are limited in addressing the cases of information warfare or cyber warfare. I'll do it very quickly because both of my examples have been already mentioned yesterday, so there is no need to be pedantic. But Article 2 for the UN Charter states that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Sorry, state was meant to be red, not independence. Or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of United Nations. Well, the first question is quite obvious. What counts as a use of force in the context of a cyber attack? Where the threshold is? I think that there is an even more interesting question, which is when we have set the threshold, how do we deal with all the stuff that goes below the threshold? Of course, if I have a virus and I use the virus to hijack this air system control of Italy, and then I kill thousands of people, that attack is going to be treated as if I had used a bomb or a missile. But what about some stuff that goes below the threshold? What if I just erase some data, or I impair the system working on the system for 2 hours? That's where the philosophical or the ethical or the regulatory meat is. And just to go a bit further, Articles 51 and 57 to the Additional Protocol 1, an attack which may be expected to cause incidental loss to civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects, or combination of the above. That's what an attack is. What is missing? These days, objects are not just physical anymore. They are not just tangible anymore. There are plenty of objects or things that exist, but they are intangible. My profile on Facebook exists, but it's intangible. My music, I don't have a CD, I haven't bought a CD in decades, but it's there. It's intangible, but it's there. So how do we deal with those stuff? With that stuff, which is not physical, which is intangible, which is abstract, and still which is important nonetheless. So taking this context into the definition of attack, for example, you start to understand where the problems are. Now, if you go to the Tallinn manual, which is the text that is kind of becoming mainstream into addressing the regulation of cyber warfare, and has done a lot of job in this context, you'll see that the definition of a cyber attack is given in these terms: a cyber operation, whether offensive or defensive, that is reasonably expected to cause injury or death to person, or damage or destruction to object. Again, physical object. There is no mentioning of intangibility, of virtuality, or irreality. How do we deal with that? And this affects a lot of aspects, and of course, using bello and use of bello. Refining this definition in the Tallinn manual, you see that a cyber attack amounts to the use of force if scales and effect are similar to those of non-cyber operation. And the analogic approach, or the analogic method, continues insofar as to assess whether the effects are similar. They would endorse the Pickett's test or other way of comparing the effects of an attack. I'm just going to skip through this to stress this a bit. Below the threshold, there is a big issue, for example, that is the one of functionality. When you can do harm, which is reversible, is temporary, it doesn't compromise the system forever, but just for an hour or the span of time you might need it. And this is where the attention should be focused. To focus on this attention, on this problem, we need to take a step back. Most of the philosophical problems are problems that requires a runner-up. You run up and then you jump. And these are the step back that we need to take. The first one is understanding that just war theory as an ethical theory, it still works. The ethical principles of the theory are still very much desirable. They are valid and they are there. We don't have to throw them away at all. But the applicability of those principles is problematic insofar as we don't understand that there is a gap between what we were used to consider as problematic in waging warfare and what we are doing these days. The gap is ontological. There is stuff which has new properties. This is in a different way than the stuff that we were used to deal with until yesterday, and we need to account for that. Now, accounting for that means understanding that we need a conceptual change. The concepts like the one of harms, violence, force, attack, state, warfare are evolving. We don't have to be afraid to think into that in a problematic manner. We might end up saying that there is no such a radical change, but we need to consider whether there is any conceptual change to be addressed. So, for example, Diepert says that we need a concept of harm which focuses away from the injury to human beings or physical objects, and is more focused on the notion of malfunctioning of informational systems and other systems which might depend on them. This is just a way of how things could be changing. to address the so-called ontological issues. I will not go into details yesterday on this, because yesterday Paul Cornish basically gave my talk. But basically it's the idea that, exactly, I mean, we had a set of properties to categorize reality and existence, and that set of property doesn't describe precisely anymore the things that exist these days and with which we interact these days. And so just before pointing to the direction to address this problem, I wanted to stress that this is not just philosophical dreaming or visionary scholarly work done in front of a desk drinking tea or sherry, depending on the time of the day. While philosophers are pointing to the need of considering disruption and corruption of data as something that has to be focal in defining, for example, a cyber attack, the same approach has been taken by, for example, the US National Research Council, which is a council that shapes public opinion and policy in the US. So it's a kind of people with their feet down to earth and not dreaming in ivory towers. And they also say that a cyber attack is the use of deliberate actions, perhaps over an extended period of time, to alter, disrupt, deceive, degrade, destroy adversary computer system or network, or the informational and the programs resident in or transiting these systems or networks. So the step that has to be made is not a step going to sci-fi. It's not, the direction is not the one of a dreaming hyper-uranium. It's very pragmatic, and the extension of the scope doesn't require to be radical, but has to be made in order for this definition or any other definition of cyber attack to be more appropriate and satisfactory when it comes to dealing with such important issues. So I'll skip the paradox of the more good than harm principle, because I don't want to upset my military friends, and I'll just go to the final bit. So when it comes to information warfare or cyber warfare, and you look at it by trying to understand what are the situations in which you don't want to end up with, there are three sets of problems. I call them the 3 R problems because they all start with R, so it was kind of easy to identify them. You have the risk that since cyber warfare is so cheap, there is less risk for casualties. It makes it easier for political authorities to justify cyber warfare than to ship hundreds of people somewhere else in the world. You have the risk that the number of conflicts in the world might increase, or that there might be escalation. So this is one thing you want to avoid. The other thing is that, as we have seen it with the NSA scandal a few years ago, the threats coming from the cybersphere become pervasive and more important. We are more dependent on the cybersphere, so we want to watch out and make sure that all the possible threats and risks are foreseen and countered before they become too difficult. To do so, we increase surveillance. You increase surveillance, you breach privacy, anonymity, transparency, and so on. So rights are also a stake. In the jargon, it's called the many ends problems. If you have 5 people, just to be optimistic, designing a virus or a cyber weapon, and then you have a firm deploying the weapon, and then you have the military buying the weapon from the firm and using it online, and God forbid something wrong happens, who's going to be responsible for that? Assessing responsibility, moral responsibility, before even legal responsibility, is a heck of a problem. So how do we get out of this impasse? We go back to the big picture. We remember that we are in the age of the information revolution. We remember that there is a blurring, that reality is not just anymore physical, reality is virtual and physical. Things that are non-physical, they exist nonetheless. And we understand that in such a context of such radical changes, the policy gap is of course something that rests on a conceptual muddle, on a lot of conceptual confusions. And then in order to address the policy gap, we need to do the running up. We need to step backwards to jump farther. And so what we need to do is to understand the conceptual nature of the reality in which we live these days. And then from an ethical perspective, but even just from the perspective we want to endorse, we need to extend the scope of the stuff that we value as important. We need to start to understand that informational objects, for example, as they are relevant into the contemporary society, they also have a moral stance which needs to be addressed. Now, it might sound, again, science fiction, but we have already done this in the past 20 or 30 years. Think about biomedics. The fact that we ascribe moral values to things that are alive, not because they are human beings, just because they are alive. Or think about environmental ethics. We ascribe moral value to the environment, stones, mountains, trees. They are valuable, although they are not human beings, they are not biological beings. So it's not really inconceivable to think that even informational objects might have some kind of moral values that we want to preserve. Because once we do that, we will be in a better position to start to understand how do we want to regulate ethically cyber warfare. And with that, I'll thank you very much.